Europe wants to target about 1,600 companies and individuals who support Putin, with the goal of curbing the military-industrial complex that supports the invasion of Ukraine. And if the proposal is approved, the number of Russian entities sanctioned by Brussels would increase from about 3,000 to over 4,500. Keep in mind that Kaja Kallas spoke about the new sanctions, which are the most extensive since the beginning of the conflict, adding that the sanctions have already cost Russia over 1,000 billion euros. The new sanctions are expected to include asset freezes, new payment restrictions, and travel bans. The proposal should be presented to European countries at the beginning of September, with the goal of approving it in October. But in order to come into effect, it will still require the approval of all member states, so for now it is still just a proposal. However, for more than 4 years, the West has been sanctioning Russia, but Putin continues the invasion of Ukraine anyway. And this makes it necessary to understand why Europe keeps relying on this strategy with new packages. And above all, we need to understand what effects the sanctions have had so far. I've noticed that many of you watch my videos and I'm really super happy about it, but you're not subscribed. So if you like my analysis, subscribe to the channel. It's free for you, but it's really vital for the project. Thank you very much. Sanctions need to be constantly updated, because with every new package, Moscow tries to find new ways to get around them, continuing to trade and move money using alternative channels. Basically, if a Russian company can no longer buy European technology, it can still try to get it through a company from another country. That's why sanctions need to be constantly updated in order to close off these alternative routes as well. That's why, over the years, the European Union has increasingly focused on circumvention, meaning attempts to get around the sanctions. And as early as 2023, relations with third countries have been strengthened precisely to prevent the re-export to Russia of sanctioned goods. Later on, new rules were introduced for European exporters, and more entities outside Russia have been targeted, who were helping the Kremlin. So much so that in the 20th package approved in April 2026, the Union used the anti-circumvention tool for the first time against Kyrgyzstan, which was accused of not preventing the re-export to Russia of certain European technologies that can be used in the production of drones and missiles. The same package then targeted 60 entities, 32 of which were in Russia and 28 in other countries, directly or indirectly involved in military production or in circumventing the sanctions. As is evident, it is therefore wrong to measure the effectiveness of the sanctions by the number of packages, because each package actually responds to Russian countermeasures to circumvent the previous package, or it sanctions new entities that had not previously been targeted or identified. Furthermore, the European strategy has evolved over time. In the first months of the conflict, in fact, major sanctions were imposed on banks, Russian companies and technology, while later, Russian oil exports were also targeted, and in December 2022, the oil price cap was introduced. This limits the price at which crude oil transported by sea can be sold using Western services such as insurance. Then, in the following years, Brussels increasingly focused on how Russia circumvents the sanctions. For example, by targeting foreign banks and ships from the infamous Shadow Fleet. And in July 2026, with the 21st package, new restrictions were introduced against financial institutions, against platforms used for cryptocurrency transactions, and against companies that help Moscow obtain technologies that can be used for military purposes. And so, the approximately 1,600 new sanctioned entities planned for the fall follow this evolution, and should mainly focus on the people and companies that enable the Russian war machine to continue operating. But are these sanctions really effective, and will they be in the future? Targeting these entities doesn't necessarily stop Russian factories, because various Western products still manage to reach Russia by circumventing sanctions through foreign suppliers and intermediaries, even if often at a higher price. And that's because circumventing sanctions usually requires more steps, which increases cost. On top of that, intermediaries who take on the risk of violating or evading them can charge higher prices for this very reason. Moscow can also replace some of them. Western products with technologies and spare parts produced in other countries, especially in China. But this increases dependence on a few suppliers, and for some advanced technologies, there aren't always alternatives with the same features. In fact, an analysis by CSIS published in July 2026 claims that the Russian defense industry continues to depend on foreign technology, and note, especially Western technology, and that Russia is unable to replace several advanced components on a large scale. Furthermore, due to Western export controls, for some industrial products, Russia reportedly paid prices up to 10 times higher than those on the world market. However, unfortunately, at the moment, the sanctions have not forced Putin to stop the conflict. In fact, Russia has managed to absorb the initial impact better than expected. In 2022, the Russian GDP actually contracted by only 1.4%. While the Russian central bank in the spring of that same year expected an 8% contraction for 2022, meanwhile in 2023 and 2024, the Russian GDP actually grew by 4.1% and 4.9% respectively. However, it must also be said that this was largely artificial growth, greatly inflated by public spending related to the war. That is, due to the fact that many companies in the defense sector became richer and profited thanks to the Kremlin's orders for weapons. Orders financed, of course with taxpayers' money or by taking on debt. The fact is that what allowed Russia to stay afloat were mainly energy exports and the ability to shift a good part of its commercial relations, which before were towards Europe and in any case towards the West, towards non-Western countries with oil and gas, which represent about 1/5 of Russia's budget revenues. And for 2026, the government expects energy revenues of 8,920 billion rubles, about $107 billion, out of total expected revenues of 40,283 billion rubles, which is about $483 billion. Furthermore, the higher oil price due to the conflict in Iran helps Putin so much that by the end of July, it was estimated that in July 2026, Russian revenues from oil and gas could increase by 60%, compared to the same month in 2025. And logically, part of the Russian oil that was previously sold to the West has found new buyers in Asia. Just think that in August 2026, China would have imported about 1.25 million barrels per day by sea, in addition to almost 1 million through pipelines, while India about 1.87 million barrels per day. In short, the sanctions have not prevented Russia from selling its oil. However, they have forced Russia to depend more and more on China. Not to mention the fact that Russia has generally been forced in these years to sell its oil to both China and India at a discount, precisely because these two countries were in fact the only two major buyers. And moreover, as we will see now, it seems that the economic growth driven by public spending due to the war economy is starting to lose steam. But let's start with the dependence on China. According to the sources I analyzed, which you can find in the description if you want, in 2023, over 90% of Russian semiconductor imports came from China, and more than half of them were made up of Western products or products made in the West, which still managed to reach Russia through alternative channels. Another analysis then shows that for some categories of high-priority products, the share coming from China would increase from 54.3% in 2022 to 84.6% in 2025. Moscow, we have to say, was somehow able to adapt to the sanctions, but it did so by increasing its dependence on a few partners and using more complex and expensive trade channels. And this helps us understand why sanctions have an effect even without causing the collapse of the economy, or even without necessarily forcing Putin to stop the invasion. However, as mentioned earlier, the growth of the Russian GDP is now starting to falter. Already in the first quarter of 2025, growth compared to the same period of the previous year had already dropped to 1.4%. The slowdown is linked to high interest rates, still at 14%, labor shortages and problems in supply chains. In addition, at the end of May 2025, Russia still had 2.8 trillion rubles available in its national fund. That's about 71% less than before the invasion. The government was increasing its debt to finance its expenses. The fact is that in 2025, GDP growth stopped at 1%, and in 2026, the Russian central bank expects growth between 0 and 1%, much less than the 4% annual growth that occurred in 2023 and 2024. And this also means that there is a risk of stagnation, that is, an economy that does not grow. In fact, since there is still an annual inflation rate around 6%, there is even the risk of stagflation. Stagflation is a nightmare for economists, because it is a situation where the economy does not grow, but at the same time prices rise. In any case, this scenario makes the current situation different compared to the beginning of the invasion, because Russia has to simultaneously sustain large-scale military production, pressures on public finances, a growing dependence on alternative channels, and increasingly targeted sanctions. And all this without the strength of a GDP growing at 4% per year. However, we must say there are still significant limits to Europe's ability to act. Russia continues to sell oil to China and India. Various Western products still manage to reach the country by circumventing sanctions, and for this reason, as we said, Europe has started targeting banks and suppliers outside of Russia. But then, we also have an internal problem within the European Union, because new sanctions always have to be approved by all member states, and each country has different economic interests. And even during the negotiations on the 21st package, which is the latest one that was approved, divisions emerged, especially from Greece in this case, while in the past we had them, for example, from Hungary, but not only from there. Furthermore, sanctions can also have a cost for the countries that impose them, especially when they affect important sectors like energy. So Europe has to try to balance, on one hand, the interest of increasing pressure on Russia, and on the other hand, the interest of not harming its own economy. All this, however, helps us understand what the real needs are today, which is to keep updating the sanctions, because they still help a lot to slow down Putin's army. Just imagine if these restrictions weren't in place. Moscow would have full access to Western technologies and banks, not to mention all the services related to the export of oil by sea. But sanctions alone are not everything. It's also important to support Ukraine, because it has a smaller economy than Russia, of course, and a smaller population. So on its own, it will have enormous difficulties. Furthermore, it will be appropriate to take serious action to end the unanimity requirement for European decisions, so as not to always slow down the creation of new sanctions packages. Not to mention that, beyond sanctions, with the issue of unanimity, which is in fact a right of veto granted to every single country in the Union, we have enormous limitations for any decision we want to make. And do you think the sanctions are really slowing down Putin? Let me know in the comments, leave a like, hype it up, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy my content. Bye!